Philip gazed at the abacus. The lines of green beads danced before his eyes. There was a bit of shade from the fig tree, but even so, sweat trickled down his brow. His heart was hammering. "Calm down," he told himself fiercely. "You've used an abacus before." He looked again at the battered old calculator on the table. What was it Cleon had always told his pupils? Yes, that as it. The abacus can never lie. Lalda sat at the console of CMF-22, probably the most powerful and reliable computer in the known universe. It was soothing to see the lines of green lights across the top of the instrument panel. That meant all functions were in working order. The ship was on course. Gloving a hand to the gleaming instrument panel, she pressed for auto-check, vocal mode. Autopilot check. The tinny voice rang out through the cabin. Navigation drive check. Scanning systems check. Lalda breathed out a sigh. Even though Brielle had died and she was now on her own, it was going to be all right. Philip shifted on the stool and looked towards the site. A gang of slaves was hard at work digging the foundations. Suddenly he saw the foreman coming back, and with him was Simon, the architect. The two men were talking earnestly as they walked, and once or twice Simon stopped and consulted a scroll he was carrying. Philip leapt to his feet, but the architect and foreman took no notice of him. They gazed towards the site and earned on their conversation. "Oh, it'll be superb," Simon burst out suddenly. "We really are building a temple worthy of Apollo." "May he shine forever," murmured the foreman dutifully. They stood for a while in silence. Then Simon went on in a thoughtful tone. "You know, there's a man in Athens who says the sun is a mass of flaming material, and the moon's light is just a reflection of the sun." The foreman shook his head at the very thought of such weird ideas. A tear ran down Lalda's face. It was 28 days now since Brielle had died, and she seemed to miss her more every day. Okay, she had been a bit bossy, a bit know-it-all, not the sort of person have chosen to train you on your fur hall flight, but she was someone. Lalda missed the sound of the human voice. Wearily, Lalda pulled out the bunk inside of the control room and started climbing onto it, and suddenly stopped. The checks. She must do the checks. Groaned. There was no point in doing the checks. The CMF-22 was on autopilots, so she didn't have to do the checks. Okay, Brielle would have been horrified. She wasn't here, was she? For a few seconds, Lalda stayed where she was, motionless, and then her 7 years of training at Space College won out. She got down off the bunk again and turned on the scanner screens, one by one. They're here, 6 curved screens, relating to 6 scanners round the ship. Star-studded black, star-studded black, but the 5th scanner had a glow at the edge. The sun. Lalda stared at the sun for a few seconds. Then she reached over to the far right of her console and took a reading of the ship's surrounding temperature, 2.61. She climbed onto her bunk and tried to sleep. "So you're the young man asking for work," said Simon. Philip nodded. "Yes, sir." "Know anything about architecture? Building works?" Philip lowered his eyes. "Nothing, sir." Simon put his scroll on the same table and sat down on a stool. "Well, I could certainly do with a bright boy." Simon narrowed his eyes. "But why should I choose you?" Philip drew a deep breath. "Because I desperately need the work. And if I don't earn any money soon, my mother and sister and I will starve." "No, don't say that." "It may be true, but don't say that." "Because I'll work hard and I learn quick," Philip stammered out. "And you won't be sorry if you take me on. Really, you won't." Simon gazed at him for a few seconds. "Well, I should be able to give you a mal." He reached over and picked up the abacus from the table. Lalda wheeled her seat along to the main console to do the checks. Everything was fine. Of course, everything was fine. After all, you don't expect a 22nd generation computer to get things wrong, do you? She lit up the scanner screens. She thought. The glow from the sun seemed brighter, reached further. Simon spun a bead on the abacus. I do need someone with a head for figures. It's helpful when my clerk's away. Philip sat on the stool, trying to look like someone with a head for figures. Simon twirled his dark beard and looked straight at Philip. You can manage basic calculations, can't you? Yes, said Philip. Simon put the abacus in his hands. Okay, let's see what you can do. He unrolled his papyrus scroll again and surveyed it. Philip held the abacus on his lay and tried to stop the shaking of his hands. Stay calm, he told himself furiously. You can use an abacus. You were old Cleon's best pupil before you had to stop school. You can't have forgotten. Simon's voice broke in. Add 350 and 75. Lalda poured herself some fruit juice, then started towards the control room, carrying the cup. Suddenly she stopped. What was she doing? No loose liquids in the control room. That was the rule. How could she ever forget? It was almost the first thing she had learnt in flight training. She threw the drink down the chute. Back in the control room, she ran her eye over the instrument panel and started her checks. Autopilot, check. Pinged CMF-22. Coordinates log, check. Navigation drive, check. Good old CMF-22, thought Lalda. She felt safe. She didn't really have to do a thing until re-entry and landing time, and even then the people on Earth base would be overseeing operations. They wouldn't be taking any chances, not with her cargo of 500,000 precious pacticles of lithinium. She started turning on the scanners. Star-studded black, star-studded black. Oh! The glow of the sun was stronger than ever. On the fifth screen, Lalda frowned. The sun, surely. It was bigger. Philip gave a little shake to get all the beads down to the side of the abacus. Then he took a deep breath and set up the 350. None on the first, units row, 5 beads on the second, the tens row, 3 beads on the third, the hundreds row. Well, that was easy enough. Now to add on the 75. Philip moved 5 beads over on the units row. That was fine. Then he looked at the tens row. He couldn't move 7. There weren't enough. Don't panic, you know what to do, he told himself. He moved 1 bead over from the hundreds row, then 3 back from the tens row, and read his answer off. 425. Simon nodded matter-of-factly. That's it. A subtraction now, I think. Hands shaking, Lalda moved over to get a reading on the ship's surrounding temperature. It was 2.84, and it had been 2.61. She sat back in her chair, heart thumping. Surely that meant the ship was moving towards the sun. She couldn't believe it. She lifted her eyes to the row of lights at the top of the instrument panel. Green. Every single one of them. Green. What had gone wrong? Suddenly, with a furious movement, she launched herself at the console. Her fingers flew on buttons, switches, dials, keyboards. The answers were still the same. As far as CMF-22 was concerned, the ship was on course. The sun was high in the sky now. Philip was vaguely aware that the slaves had stopped for a break, but his whole body was tensed, waiting. Subtraction. He prayed that he would be able to do it. He thought of what his teacher Cleon had told him. The abacus is always right. If there is a mistake, it is you. The architect nodded and glanced towards the site. Last one now. 5,000 take away 5. Philip got to work. The hundreds line would need 9 beads in it. He counted them one by one as he pushed them over. Soon he had finished. He looked at the result. 4,895. He was just about to say it when something stopped him. But how could he be wrong? He was quite sure he had moved all the beads correctly, and an abacus couldn't be wrong, could it? Could he trust his own judgment against the calculator? Simon was waiting for his answer. Philip's head was buzzing. What was she to do? All CMF-22's self-check programs were telling her everything was okay. But Lalda knew it wasn't, and the longer she left it, the worse it would get. The sun was still millions of miles away, but at some stage its radiation would start to affect the spaceship's functions. Then she sat back in her seat. Should she override the autopilot and navigate the ship herself? Should she? On the one hand was CMF-22, probably the most powerful and reliable computer in the known universe. On the other hand was... what? The instincts of an inexperienced space pilot? Should she really trust her own judgment? Turning her seat sideways, she pressed a button. A curved shutter slid away, disclosing a panel of pilot control instruments. She stared at the startup button. Philip made his decision. 4995, he said. Philip looked down so as not to meet Simon's eyes. And then he stared, for there by his bare feet were 2 bits of green pottery, 2 halves of the sort of bead you would find on an abacus. His heart leapt. He looked up at Simon the architect, at his new employer. The autopilot was put on hold. Lalda had got all the readings she needed. She was nudging the ship round in an arc. She was beginning to feel happy, confident. Maybe she really could do it. Maybe she could navigate the ship to Earth. There was a beeping noise. She glanced up at the row of lights on the instrument panel. The second light from the end wasn't green anymore. It was red, and lit up on its surface were the words, "Autopilot functions failure." Her heart leapt. She looked back at the screens, at the world of space. That was hers.